My name's Dennis Kremen. I'm in the history department here at Lewis University, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you, all of you here, for what is the inaugural Jim Sczepaniak lecture series. So I see students, faculty, staff, community members, members of Jim's family. I want to just thank you all for coming because this is a really auspicious occasion. This is a big deal for our history department to have something like this. And so I just really want to thank you. It's also my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. David Livingston, president of Lewis University. Dr. Livingston grew up in nearby Dundee, Illinois. He was educated and earned his bachelor's degree from Augustana College in chemistry. He went on to earn a MA in theology from Loyola University, and he completed his PhD in theology from Vanderbilt University. We're very fortunate to have him here to be leading us forward and to speak. He, prior to becoming to Lewis University, he was at Lourdes University in Sylvania, Ohio. I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Livingston.
Thank you, Dr. Kremen. Dennis has done a great job of guiding this history department. I've only been here for about 4 months, and it is clear that the history department, this lecture series, our connection to the broader Joliet community in terms of historical societies and museums is quite intense, and deep-rooted, and we're really grateful for that. As president of Lewis, I am very pleased to welcome you all here to the inaugural lecture of the James and Mary Claire Sczepaniak lecture series. This series was funded by an exceptionally generous estate gift, which made it possible for us to keep history, and especially history of this area, alive and well. It's because of Jim and Mary Claire's amazing legacy of generosity, education, and service to the Joliet, Bolingbrook, Lockport, and Romeoville communities that we're here today to celebrate this inaugural lecture. As some of you know, both Jim and Mary Claire, Jim's first wife, each spent more than 30 years in the field of education. Mary Claire taught at the Cathedral of St. Raymond and the Valley View School District, and Jim taught history and social studies at a number of local schools, including Romeoville High School. Jim, throughout his life, also had a great passion for the study of history and was a volunteer and supporter of many local historical societies. As such, it is very fitting that Jim's estate gift will now continue the amazing educational legacy that Jim and Mary Claire started during their lifetimes. And the gift will benefit students here at Lewis University, but also people from the broader community, as we can see very clearly here this morning. Today's lecture is also very special because of having our inaugural speaker, Dr. Robert Sterling, who was a personal friend of Jim Sczepaniak, and Jim was also a great admirer of Dr. Sterling's academic work, especially all of his historical work related to Joliet and its neighboring communities. Jim and Mary Claire would be particularly pleased that such a distinguished scholar will be responsible for launching this series. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not personally recognize Fran now Sczepaniak, who's sitting in the front row with her family members, Jim's widow, who is in our audience, and thank Fran for all the work that she's done to help create this lecture series. We're really grateful, Fran. Her vision, along with his vision, are helping us to look forward into the future of how history at Lewis University and in the region can stand. And as a liberal arts school and as somebody who comes out of the humanities, I can tell you I spent much of my life studying history of Christianity, and as we look at what's going on in our society and the political climate, the geopolitics that are going on, we have much to learn from history, and we have much to learn from the history of this area. And I'm going to bring Dr. Kremen back up to introduce our speaker, but I want to thank you, Bob, for being here. Thank you, Dennis, for all the work you do, and to thank our faculty and our staff. We have an amazing faculty, especially an amazing faculty in arts and sciences, who keep alive things like history and literature and philosophy and theology. So, Dr. Kremen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Livingston. I want to add to that gratitude idea. Once we move past Halloween, and it's right around the corner, okay, we kind of look towards Thanksgiving, and we have so much to be thankful for. Thank you to the wonderful leadership of Eileen McMahon, chair of the history department, and my other colleagues in that department. Also, we have conferencing and events, marketing and communications. We have so many people that go into this work behind the scenes. We even have Emmy Award-winning John Kilpatrick videoing the proceedings today. So I just want to thank them and personally, because it's amazing. And thank you guys for coming out. My honor to introduce Bob Sterling. I've known Bob for about 20 years. I first met him when he was the chair of Social and Behavioral Sciences Department at Joliet Junior College, a position that he had for more years than probably he wants to remember. I taught U.S. Survey for him before coming to Lewis University. We also partnered on an exhibit at the Joliet Area Historical Museum, the John C. Hobelt, the Soaring Achievements of John C. Hobelt permanent exhibit that's there. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth seeing. Bob, as many of you know, grew up in Joliet. He earned his undergraduate degree from Wheaton College. He then went on and earned a doctorate in history from Northern Illinois University with a concentration in the Civil War. And today he's presenting Bars and Stripes, the Old Joliet Prison, which draws on his book titled Joliet Prisons, Images in Time. We've gotten very close to Dr. Sterling here. He donated his core research collection to the Edelman Regional History Collection here at Lewis University, making them available to students, faculty, researchers across the country. And we really thank him for that. Many of you are looking also beyond Thanksgiving towards Christmas. And I just want to plug that Dr. Sterling will be over at a new prison exhibit over at the Gaylord Building tonight, and he'll have a book signing there for his books. I want to thank our partners from the Joliet Area Historical Museum and also the Gaylord Building Historic Site. So look for this. It's at 5:30 this evening. So my pleasure to bring you Dr. Robert Sterling.
Thank you, Dennis. It's an honor to be here today, and I appreciate the invitation to be the inaugural program for the Sczepaniak Speaker Series. I first got to know Jim Sczepaniak when we served together on the Joliet Public Library Board of Trustees. Since we both taught history and we both had an interest in local history, we became good friends. And we saw each other quite often at history programs and events. He was a source of encouragement when I was writing my book on Joliet prisons, the subject of today's program. Like many of you, I've long been intrigued by the prison's huge stone walls and the corner towers that loom up like a medieval fortress on the northeast side of Joliet. As a child, I remember riding past the prison in my family car and quietly clicking the lock on the car door That bring back any memories? After college, I returned to Joliet and began a long career teaching history at Joliet Junior College. I actually had the opportunity to teach a history class in the old prison in the mid-1970s. I think my most vivid memory of that experience is being patted down and having my briefcase searched, and then hearing the prison door slam shut behind me as I nervously entered that first day to teach. I don't think I ever really got comfortable with that sound. Well, the program today is primarily on the early history of the old Joliet prison. The first prison in Illinois was built in Alton in 1831. Pictured here on the far right, the Alton prison was operated not by the state, but was rather leased to a businessman. He was responsible for hiring the warden, and he was responsible for all of the expenses, including feeding and clothing the inmates. He leased out convict labor to the highest bidders of businessmen in the area. So it was a business enterprise. Obviously, under this system, cutting corners on food and skimping where he could meant more profit for him, and he died a very wealthy person. Dorothea Dix, in 1846, who was a social reformer, many of you familiar with that name, she visited the Alton prison as part of her campaign to bring change to the nation's prisons. She filed a very critical report describing serious overcrowding at the Alton prison. She said many inmates were chained to the hallways or were confined in the cellar. The eating area had a dirt floor, and there were no tables and chairs. All the inmates ate their meals standing up. There were no bathing facilities and no religious instruction. If cleanliness is next to godliness, they didn't have either at Alton. Dix concluded that a new penitentiary with a different kind of management system was desperately needed in Illinois. In 1853, Governor Joel Madison recommended that a new prison be built. He suggested in the northern part of the state near Chicago. Since Governor Madison was from Joliet, he undoubtedly thought that the Joliet area would be an ideal location. 4 years later, the General Assembly passed a law authorizing the building of a new state prison. The law also established a commission of 3 people to select a site for the prison and to oversee its construction. One member of this committee was Nelson Elwood, who had just finished a term as mayor of Joliet. So we have a Joliet connection in Springfield and also on this committee. Well, the commission's search for the best possible location led Elwood and his committee members to the northeast side of Joliet. Imagine that. Well, political influence aside, the location was ideal for a prison. After all, the land did rest on a solid bed of limestone, which could be quarried to build the walls and the buildings. And of course, tunneling to escape would be virtually impossible. The prison plan, of course, needed an architect, and William W. Boynton, who also designed the Chicago Water Tower, was the architect for the new prison. The plan called for a square prison yard, 15 acres, and there would be massive walls, 25 feet high, on 3 sides of this 15-acre parcel of land. On the fourth side, the side facing town, an administration building was built, 4 stories high, with cell houses on either side. So instead of the fourth wall, the south side consists of the administration building and the 2 cell houses. Construction began in 1858 when the first group of inmate laborers arrived from Alton Prison. So inmates actually built the prison. They began working in the prison quarry, breaking rock, and construction went on. Within 6 months, over 200 prisoners were involved in constructing the old Joliet prison. When it was opened, the Joliet prison was the largest prison in the country, and it became a model for other prisons in other states. The East Cell House was completed first, and it had 4 tiers, 4 levels of cells. Each tier had 100 cells. Iron stairways led to the upper tiers, and there were rather narrow galleries in front of the cells. The cells had no outside windows for natural light or ventilation. In fact, the only air, light, or heat that entered the cells came through the iron bars of the door. Looking at photographs like this makes you wonder who these inmates were and what they had done. The prison chaplain in 1864 reported that the oldest convict was 68 years old. The youngest was 10. In fact, there were 2 10-year-olds and a 13-year-old. The state had no separate facility at that time for young offenders. That didn't happen until 1871. This report also indicated that over half of the inmates were doing time for larceny. One man was serving 30 days for having 3 wives. Is that 10 days a wife? Interesting. Well, the cells were just 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, and 7 feet high. Although they were intended for 1 person, they soon held 2. The typical cell had 2 bunks, each furnished with a corn husk mattress, a pillow, sheets, and a woolen blanket. Each cell also had 2 small stools, a tin cup, a ceramic water jar that you see there in the doorway, and a bucket for a toilet. These slop buckets, as they were often called, were emptied every morning in the sewage ditch out in the prison yard. You can imagine the smell, both in the cell houses and out in the prison yard, was almost unbearable, especially in the summer. The cells were not equipped with water and plumbing until the early 1950s. The system of prison management was known as the Auburn system, and it included in part the striped uniforms, lock-step marching, and total silence under the watchful gaze of guards who were known as keepers. And the only weapon the keepers had was a cane. Very few letters and few visitors were permitted, and no recreation or entertainment was allowed. The black and white striped uniform remained the standard uniform until 1896. Over the years, there was considerable criticism of the contract labor system, by which prison labor was contracted out to the highest bidder. The bids usually came in somewhere between 60 and 80 cents per inmate per day. A number of buildings in the prison housed the shops where the work was done. These private companies provided training and supervision, and the prison personnel provided security. As you might imagine, the prison labor issue had definite political overtones. Some newspapers and politicians took the side of local laborers who complained about the terrible impact of convict labor on jobs and wages in the Joliet area. In 1870, for example, one Joliet newspaper listed the goods produced by inmates at the prison in a period of just 1 month. 500,000 cigars in 1 month, 600 dozen brooms, 270 cane seat chairs, 127 cases of boots and shoes, 250 wagons, 7,500 feet of dressed stone, not to mention the cut stone, the cultivators, the wheelbarrows, the tents, the harnesses, the horse collars. A number of things were produced at the prison. Eventually, labor unions applied sufficient pressure to end this contract labor system. After that, prison shops were restricted to producing items only for use in the prison or in other state agencies. Well, let's shift gears and talk about the daily routine in prison. At 5:45 a.m., a bell rang and everyone was expected to get up, clean up, and quickly get ready to exit the cell. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the armed guards assumed their positions in the towers and on the prison walls. Next, the cells were unlocked, and on command, the men fell into line with slop bucket in hand, and they marched out to the yard and emptied the buckets. Then they were marched to the kitchen, where they were given a quart of coffee, several slices of bread, and a small helping of hash. They were then marched back to their cells where they ate breakfast. In 1900, the prison recipe for breakfast hash was 560 pounds of beef, 60 pounds of bacon, and 22 bushels of potatoes, all mixed together. I'd be happy to repeat that if anyone would like the recipe. A family reunion or something coming up. After breakfast, the prison bell sounded at 6:45 a.m. to signal the beginning of the workday. With cane in hand, the keepers or guards marched the men to their work assignments. While moving in lockstep, each man was required to place his right hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, turn his face toward the guard, and maintain strict silence and obey every order. Work in the prison quarry across the street was very heavy, hard labor. But at least it was outside, away from the stench of the cell houses or smell houses and the sewage ditch inside the prison walls. Most men, however, worked in one of the prison shops within the walls, and for many years, cigar making was the mainstay of prison employment. This, of course, put the prison in competition with local cigar makers, like those pictured here who worked at the Achenbach cigar store on Jefferson Street. And some of them don't look very happy. Other companies utilizing convict labor included this granite company that made ornamental items out of stone. Indeed, some inmates learned trades that they might use after their release, like making chairs in the furniture shop. The rattan shop turned out an impressive quantity and variety of tables and chairs. Prison rules required absolute silence at work, and inmates had to keep their eyes fixed on their work at all times. Another prison industry was the shoe and boot shop. The officer either stood on a platform or sat on a high stool, from which he could watch the entire room. One guard observed that a prisoner is like a rubber ball. He will stay down as long as you press him down, but he flies up the instant the pressure is removed. He must feel pressure all the time. A whistle sounded at noon, signaling lunchtime. Again, the inmates were marched in lockstep to the kitchen to get their food. 40 minutes later, they were back in the shops. Carrying their meals to their cells, especially in the winter, meant that food was never warm when eaten. In the evening, talking was permitted, but only in hushed tones and only with your cellmate. At 9 p.m., lights were turned out, and the men were expected to retire for the evening in absolute silence. The dining hall pictured here was built in 1903, which changed the routine for eating. The hot food prepared here in the kitchen was reasonably warm when served in the new dining room nearby. Since bread was a staple at every meal, the prison bakery was kept very busy. In 1871, prisoners in the bakery were praised when they worked around the clock baking bread for victims of the Chicago fire. The loaves of bread were sliced here in the cutting room, which was adjacent to the bakery. The new dining room was a welcome change from eating in their cells. However, the seats were not designed for comfort. The rule of silence prevailed. Men sat with their arms folded, silently, waiting for the command to eat. Prison rules required inmates to bathe once a week in the summer and every other week in the winter. With some 1,300 men bathing in 15 tubs, they weren't permitted to leisurely soak. In fact, at one time, they bathed 2 in a tub to expedite the process. Since water was not changed very often, few men requested more tub time. The bathing system was vastly improved when the old iron tubs were replaced by showers in the 1920s. Prisoners always look forward to Sunday, the day of rest. The morning bell on Sunday rang at 7 a.m. instead of the usual 5:45. After breakfast, they could attend chapel services if they wished. After a few stirring songs by the inmate choir, the chaplain said a prayer and preached a sermon. One inmate remarked on the strenuous efforts to save these men who had drifted far down the currents of sin. On Sunday, no evening meal was provided since dinner was more substantial than usual, including a pudding dessert. After dinner, they remained locked in their cells until the following morning, and the weekly routine started all over again. They usually spent Sunday afternoon reading or sleeping, since talking was not permitted. This is Father Peter Crumley. He was one of the chaplains who served at the prison. In addition to holding religious services, the chaplain was in charge of the library. He often spent Sunday afternoon visiting the cell houses, distributing books and magazines. During the early years, the chaplain also helped monitor the visiting room, which was located adjacent to the chaplain's office. The sign under the clock says that visits were limited to 30 minutes, and for many years an inmate was restricted to 1 visitor every 8 weeks. Holidays were eagerly anticipated, especially the 4th of July. In 1875, a tradition was started of permitting inmates to celebrate July 4th outside in the prison yard, the only day of the year. They were treated to better food and more freedom on that one day. A Joliet newspaper described the event like this: Flags were displayed and the prisoners yelled, cheered, wrestled, boxed, ran races, jumped, performed various athletic feats, sang, waltzed, and enjoyed themselves greatly. Free speech was allowed, and it was a glorious time to converse freely with each other. Here's a boxing match between inmates held on the 4th of July. At noon, a whistle blew and the men marched in for a substantial meal and an after-dinner smoke. They spent the afternoon in their cells, quietly resting or writing letters. Prison poets often put their thoughts and feelings in verse. This poem is entitled "The 4th of July." It's a poem now. This is the only one day of the year, for it to draw nigh, I sigh. Like that? Okay. It's the greatest day of any, the 4th day of July. We enjoy ourselves like school children, and as the hours go by, we bless the men who signed that sheet on the 4th day of July. New inmates at the prison were often referred to as fresh fish. Here, some fresh fish are about to enter the kettle. This is how one new inmate described his induction to prison life. He said, "After I entered the prison, I was brought to the receiving officer's quarters where my name, age, nationality, religion, and the nature of my crime were carefully recorded. Next, I underwent the Bertillon system of physical measurements. Incidentally, this was a method of identifying people developed in France, and the Joliet prison was the first in the U.S. to adopt this way of identifying prisoners. Very careful measurements were taken, including measuring the length and width of the head. This method, of course, was later replaced by fingerprints and photographs. Well, back to the fresh fish. After being physically measured, the new inmate said, "I took a bath and changed my clothes for those of a felon." Remember, stripes were worn until 1896 and can still be seen here on the top shelf. And then he continued, "I was examined by a doctor, after which I was escorted to the barber that he might put the finishing touch of a convict on me. After my hair was cut short and the mustache shaved off, I was taken to see the deputy warden and escorted to my cell. Scarcely had I entered the cell," he said, "than the prison captain arrived and read all the prison rules to me. I slumped down on the small stool, and a black cloud of despair settled over me." The prison environment took its toll on men physically as well as emotionally, and they sometimes wound up here in the hospital. The prison certainly was not a healthy place. Not only was the smell of the slop buckets and the sewage ditches overwhelming and sickening, but the nearby steel mill emitted smoke and dust and gases that often enveloped the entire prison, placing the health of officers and inmates at risk. When inmates died in prison, the next of kin, if known, could claim the body. Otherwise, it was buried in the prison cemetery. Usually the chaplain said a few words and read a passage of Scripture. The only witnesses were those assigned to the burial detail, and of course there were no mourners. The cemetery was located on a hill northeast of the prison. Grave sites were marked with little white coffin-shaped boards. These small pine boards contain the name, the age, and the prison number of the deceased. In 1900, there were 500 of these markers, but some had already weathered and rotted away, leaving only a sunken place in the ground to indicate a grave site. At any time, prisoners could be frisked and their shells shaken down. Pictured here are some of the weapons confiscated from inmates. A concealed weapon proved to be fatal to Deputy Warden Joseph T. Clark in 1864. An incorrigible inmate named George Chase was slated for punishment because of persistent bad behavior. When Warden Clark and another officer went to Chase's cell to get him, the inmate suddenly struck the deputy warden on the side of the head with a large rock he had brought back from the quarry, concealed in the sleeve of his coat. Chase was tried, convicted of murder, and executed by hanging, the first such execution in Will County. Inmates were punished in a variety of ways for violating prison rules. In cases of flagrant wrongdoing, a whip was used in the early years, or inmates were publicly humiliated by spending time in the prison pillory. Although Illinois law outlawed this form of punishment in 1867, it took a while for this practice to catch up to the law. It went on past 1867. Other methods of punishment included taking away the few privileges that prisoners had, or else giving them the hardest work assignments. Confinement in solitary was considered hard time, which usually back then included being shackled to the cell door chest high for 12 hours at a time. Occasionally, two prisoners were handcuffed to the same cell if they were caught fighting. This gave them some quality time to work out their differences. The food in solitary was 2 ounces of bread and 1 cup of water every day. Embedded in the floor near the solitary confinement cells was the following admonition: "It's never too late to mend." I'm not sure how many inmates who did hard time took that message to heart. Men who were considered escape risks were often fitted with leg irons. Over the years, many inmates have tried to break out, sometimes in very daring and dangerous ways. Since tunneling was virtually impossible, other ways of escaping had to be devised. Some men simply tried to get up over the wall with a makeshift ladder of wood or rope. In 1865, for example, an inmate propped a long timber against the wall and actually made it over. But as he started to run, he was shot and killed by a tower guard. Other convicts were a little more creative. This is a funeral procession, you see. In 1869, for example, an inmate tried to escape by hiding in a coffin. Somehow he was able to remove the body and put it in a barrel, and then crawl into the pine box himself. On the way to the cemetery, however, the plot to gain freedom ended in failure. He made the grave mistake. Oh, that was bad. You can groan if you like. When he cracked open the tight-fitting lid to get a breath of air. And so his unsuccessful scheme ended in solitary confinement, shackled to a cell. Of course, most inmates did their time day after day, year after year, and then experienced the exhilaration of stepping out into sweet freedom again. In 1913, the progressive governor, Edward Dunn, was elected. Now, he had run for office promising prison reform, and he appointed a reform warden by the name of Edmund Allen. Allen inaugurated dramatic changes at the institution. For example, men were put to work on beautification projects like this water fountain. I think it says E.M. Allen on it. Other changes included a new method of marching. Instead of lockstep marching, loose rank marching, 2 by 2, was now done. Not only were the stripes gone, but even summer weight clothing was issued, and the strict rule of silence was abolished. All prisoners were now given 1 hour a day outside for recreation. And smoking privileges became more liberal. Warden Allen also started a school program with an enrollment of 400 and permitted inmates to publish a newspaper. Outside entertainment was brought in occasionally, like this animal show with a dog and monkey act. Allen began the concept of an honor farm, where some inmates were put to work on roads, while others lived and worked on a 2,000-acre farm. It was developed on land purchased for the new Stateville prison. Vegetables raised on the farm were served in the prison dining room. Of course, that saved the state money and made the meals even more nutritious. Maybe they threw in some tomatoes with that hash, if you want to change that recipe just a little. Honor Farm inmates were also permitted to establish a baseball team, things at HF, Honor Farm, and they could even schedule games with outside clubs. An honor band was also organized to play during meals and on special occasions. Old-timers just couldn't believe what was going on. They just couldn't believe all of this. In June 1915, Warden Allen was out of town and his wife Odette was home alone. Early one morning, a fire was discovered in the warden's quarters. Several guards broke down the door, extinguished the flames, and found the warden's wife in the bedroom, dead. The coroner reported that Odette Allen had suffered a blow to the head and probably lay unconscious when flames engulfed her bed and killed her. The fire had been started by a container of alcohol which was spread over the bedding. An inmate by the name of Campbell, Chicken Joe Campbell, who had been appointed by the warden a few months earlier to serve as Odette's personal assistant, he was charged with her murder. He was convicted on circumstantial evidence and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison by Governor Dunn, and even though the newspaper says Allen is back at his desk again, 2 weeks after this, he resigned. Although Allen's successor, Michael Zimmerman, who's pictured here on the right, he continued the reform policies, but he lasted only 2 years as warden, because on June 5th, 1917, a riot broke out at the Joliet prison, and National Guardsmen who were camped nearby in Delwood Park because of World War I, they were summoned to the scene. When the troops arrived, 7 buildings were burning, and inmates were preparing to ram a railroad car through one of the prison gates. The guardsmen cornered the convicts at bayonet point and ended the riot, which permitted the Joliet Fire Department to put out the fire. Warden Zimmerman was soon gone. He was replaced by Warden Murphy. He was a hard-nosed, old-school disciplinarian. He removed all personal belongings from the cells. He reimposed the restrictions: no more talking, silence in the workshops, no talking in the dining hall, no more outdoor recreation, no more newspaper. It would be several years before any serious reform effort was attempted again. Well, now let's take a look at female prisoners. During the early years, female prisoners, perhaps 20 or 25 of them, were incarcerated on the top floor of the administration building, way up there on the 4th floor, just above the warden's quarters. It was thought that female prisoners had one report said, pernicious influence on the morality of male prisoners. Oh, those nasty women. Sorry about that. So the female inmates were locked away on the 4th floor of the administration building, far away from the male inmates. Their quarters consisted of several dormitory rooms, a sewing room, a laundry, a dining room. A matron lived in with the women. Female inmates are seen here in the sewing room as they face the windows all day long with large piles of work on their laps. Their eyes were fixed on their work, and they were not permitted to talk. Who's the kid, you might ask? In the chair. Well, presumably the child belonged to one of the inmates. Young children who had nowhere else to go could remain with their mothers until 4 years old. Female prisoners remained locked away on the 4th floor of that building, except for the 4th of July when they could go for a walk outside, which you see them doing here. The women wore gingham dresses in contrast to the stripes that the men wore. In 1894, what's going on? In 1894, the warden said it's unfair and unjust and inhumane to confine such a large number of female convicts in that space. And so the state legislature responded by appropriating $75,000 to build a women's prison. And so the nearby quarry provided stone for the walls and the buildings. With the old prison in the foreground on the left and the new women's prison across Collins Street, it's clear that the design of the women's prison was a mini replica of the original penitentiary. It too resembled a medieval fortress. In 1896, 66 female prisoners descended 4 flights of stairs from their old quarters, walked across Collins Street, and entered their new gated community. The front administration building and the cell house unit extended out behind it. You can see both of those, the administration building and the cell house, were 3 stories high. The main building in the front contained prison offices, small hospital, solitary confinement, and living quarters for the staff. This is where the matron lived. It's on the 1st floor. Her rooms were rather large, a lot of furniture made in the prison shops. There was an industrial laundry also on the 1st floor. They did nearly 500,000 pieces of laundry each month. A bit of a design flaw because steam and unpleasant odors from the laundry penetrated the other workrooms and also went upstairs to where the cells were. The dining room seen here was also on the 1st floor. Well, on the 2nd floor is where you had the cells, 2nd and 3rd floors. The cells here in the women's prison did have a window, an exhaust fan, an air duct, electric light, toilets and sinks. The men wouldn't get that till the 1950s. This is 1896. Women's cells were 8 feet wide and not 4 feet. They were 10 feet long, 7 feet high, providing over twice the space as the cells in the men's prison, occupied by 2 male prisoners over there. So the women had a private cell until the late 1920s. In addition to working in the laundry and other prison shops, some women were assigned to mop crews like this, keeping the prison clean. Some female prisoners also made rugs. When Warden Allen became the new warden, he appointed a new matron for the women's prison, and she introduced domestic science programs. So 8 stoves were installed, teaching these female inmates to bake and cook. She also stressed the value of outdoor exercise and gardening, planted a 3-acre garden. The 1917 riot mentioned earlier and the subsequent change in wardens brought change in the women's prison as well. In fact, a new prison was built in DeWitt, Illinois in 1932, and it was decided that all female prisoners should be housed in DeWitt. And so the Joliet prison closed, the women's prison, in 1933, and thereafter it served for several years as the receiving and diagnostic center. In 1907, the state purchased 2,200 acres of land for a new prison on Route 66, about 5 miles northwest of the old prison. A commission traveled all the way to Europe to get ideas for designing the new penitentiary and recommended round cell houses, or panopticon cell houses. Construction at Stateville began in 1916. When Stateville opened in 1925, the Department of Corrections intended to close the old Joliet prison and transfer all of its inmates to Stateville. However, the state's inmate population dramatically increased during the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression, and so the old prison remained open too, even though it was showing its age. Amazingly, inmates at the old prison, as I said earlier, still had these water jars and toilet buckets until the early 1950s. The cell houses at the old prison were slow to modernize, but they did modernize them in the late 1940s and early 50s. They gutted the cell house and put in a sewer system, and so there was some renovation. But the renovation did not include cells that were much bigger than the old ones. In November of 2001, Governor George Ryan announced that the old prison was antiquated, it was in need of costly renovation, and would soon close. He estimated that closing the old prison would save the state $4 million annually. At that time, it was being used primarily as a reception and classification center anyway. A few months later, in 2002, the prison officially closed, bringing to an end its 144-year history. Of course, the Joliet prison wasn't the first one to close, and it won't be the last. It's interesting that the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's inmates. The prison population is beginning to decline because there is widespread support in both political parties for criminal justice reform. In recent years, prisons in other states have been closing, and they realize you just can't walk away and let the walls and cell houses and prison buildings decay and disintegrate. And so these shuttered prisons in other states have been repurposed and have become assets to the community. And I think we can learn from those examples. For many of them, went from that to that. For many of them, tourism and prison museums have become central to their redevelopment. Tourism generally is not sufficient to sustain these properties financially, so prisons have been repurposed with a mix of preserving and adapting. In other words, prisons elsewhere, here's another one, have been used for museums and tourism, but also for retail and commercial space, or for restaurants. The final mix between preserving and readapting really depends on a community's vision, market realities, and the kind of support state and local government is willing to provide. If we look at the old Joliet prison through this lens of mixed-use repurposing, we can easily see that tourism with a prison museum could play an important role in the prison's future, especially given the proximity of the prison to Route 66, which is traveled by thousands of tourists annually looking for interesting places to visit. It's important to move quickly, I would think, to preserve some of the crumbling prison buildings, as well as to gather important artifacts like the old electric chair, pictured here with Warden Reagan. Of course, one of the original cells with the water jar and the slop bucket would be part of a museum. A museum on the site could preserve the old Joliet prison's history and present to visitors its fascinating history. On one hand, some of the hardest disciplinarians, the most harshest rules were at the Joliet prison. But on the other hand, there were progressive wardens who led the nation in instituting innovative reforms. Well, where do things stand today, and what might the vision for the future be? Well, today the prison is minimally used as a tourist attraction. In 2009, the old Joliet Prison Park was established, which consists of 8 kiosks These kiosks provide information and pictures depicting the prison's history as well as some of its significant, cultural significance. For example, this kiosk highlights famous movies and TV shows that were shot there. Visitors cannot enter the prison, which is protected by a fence and a wall, but you can walk around the exterior and take a selfie or two with the walls and the castle-like features in the background. Again, this is where we are today. What about the vision for the future? You can discover much more about the potential future of the prison by visiting the brand new exhibit that Dr. Kremen mentioned earlier. It's at the Gaylord building where the public landing restaurant is in Lockport. They have this exhibit. This is one of the panels. The exhibit is entitled Unlocking the Past from Prisons to Vision. What a great title, huh? And Pam Owens, she and her team have done a great job developing this exhibit. In closing, I look forward to the day when tourists can actually go inside the prison and enjoy a museum with exhibits that depict the fascinating history of the prison. I'm sure the prison will be a special attraction for those who want to see where Joliet Jake Blues was released and embarked on his mission from God, right? And Elwood, yeah. But I'd like to thank Lewis University and the History Department at Lewis for inviting me to present this inaugural program in the Sczepaniak Speaker Series.
Thank you, Dr. Sterling, for a very interesting and entertaining local history. I also like to thank, of course, the Sczepaniak family for your generosity in allowing this series to begin with this wonderful inaugural lecture. Our next one will be next spring. I believe it's last Wednesday in March. I don't have that date, but it's Dr. Ben Johnson from Loyola University is going to help us commemorate the 100th anniversary of World War I, and this year he will talk about borders and borderlands and the U.S. relationship with Mexico during the war. So that'll be our dinner lecture series next spring. If anybody's interested in talking about the book Alexander Hamilton, or if you've been lucky enough to get tickets to see it, we're going to have a book discussion coming up Thursday, November 10th. It's on the alumni website, and so anybody's welcome.